Welcome to Social Studies, everybody, on this fine Wednesday. You can open your books actually to 1018. This is just me reviewing real quickly what we looked over on Monday, before our class here today on Wednesday. We looked at globalization. We started off lesson 2 here, right? Globalization, this idea that our whole world is now so connected through things like the internet and companies that are all over in different nations, that our whole world is really one big connected economy. And we talked about how that can have some good things and some bad things about it. We looked at what bubbles are, right? When companies are purchased through stocks more than really what they're worth, right? And that happened with .com, right? Websites, right? Because at first, when people were really excited about websites and all these new websites coming out when the internet was newer in the late 1990s and early 2000s, that excitement caused people to pay more for stocks for websites than probably those websites were truly worth. And when people realized, wow, websites are hard to make money off of, and those companies didn't become profitable, they crashed, right? The price of them, and many people lost money. That kind of created a hard time in the U.S. economy. Not only for that, those .com bubbles, right? Because of fraud. Some of the bigger companies in our nation, like Enron being one example, an energy company, were lying about how much profits they were actually making, and so making their stock get purchased for more because people thought their company was doing really well when it was actually struggling. And so they weren't the only company that did that, but between the .com bubble burst and those website companies were crashed down in their value, and some of the scandals that happened in our country, the early 2000s were really kind of rough for that, but also nation. Then we talked about how there's both upsides and downsides to having a global economy or global trade. The upsides, we can sell more of our products to other nations around the world, right? There's more people to sell to. Our companies can ship things overseas. We can get cheaper materials from different countries, right? That's a good thing. But one of the biggest downsides is if any major country in our world struggles, all the other countries struggle too. So when the United States struggled in the early 2000s, the rest of the world tended to struggle a little bit too, and vice versa. Today we're going to talk about some other reasons why times were tough in the early 2000s till about 2010 and a little beyond. That was not an easy time. We were in what was called a recession. Here's another reason why. When our economy was struggling, sometimes what our government will do to try to help people out is they'll lower interest rates in the Federal Reserve System. That's a really fancy way of saying this. Where do all the major banks in our nation get their money? From the Central United States Bank. They loan money from that bank. And that those banks loan money from the Central U.S. Bank, or the Federal Reserve System it's called, they have to pay an extra charge or interest back, right, to loan money like that. And usually, the Federal Reserve System charges a certain amount of interest, but sometimes they'll lower that interest to make it cheaper to borrow money, so that banks will take more money and then pass it on to the people through loans and other things like that. So one of the things our government did is they lowered the interest rate. They allowed banks to borrow money for a lot cheaper. Every once in a while they'll do that, and hoping that loans then would be cheaper and people could get more loans. And so people did. People took out especially this special kind of loan you see right here called a mortgage. A mortgage is a loan you take out to buy a piece of land or a piece of property like a house. I have a mortgage right now on my house. I don't own my house completely. I've gone to the bank and got houses are about $200,000, a typical average house like mine. And so we had to borrow not quite that much money. We were able to pay for some of it on our own, but a good amount of money from the bank in a mortgage so that we could buy our house and pay the people who used to own our house. So really the bank owns my house. I get to live in it. And I have to pay little monthly payments. And eventually after 30 years, that's how long it takes often to pay off a house. That's a long time because it's a lot of money. If I don't pay it back though, and I stop making payments, the bank can claim my house and foreclose it. That means they get it back because they really own it more than I do until I pay it all off and it becomes mine, right? And so more people took out mortgages because the interest rate was lowered. And so with more people taking out mortgages, wanting to buy homes started to fly off the market really quickly. And when there's a lot of people that want something, the price for it goes way up, right? Like Nintendo Switches right now in our world. They're sold out everywhere and they're selling for double on eBay, I've been told, because there's not enough of them and a lot of people want them right now because they're stuck inside. They think they could play video games, right? And so the prices of houses went up too because there were so many people competing for them. People were willing to pay more than they were really worth. And here's the problem with that. People were being willing to pay more than what the houses were worth, and the banks thought, well, hey, if houses are going to keep increasing in value, we'll keep lending money. They were doing what were called subprime mortgages. Subprime means not very good. Those are risky loans on homes of far more than the house is truly worth. So let's say there's 10 people that all wanted to buy a home that normally would have cost $200,000, and somebody's really desperate to get a home, and there's 10 people all wanting the same home. Maybe he'd say, you know what, I'll pay $220,000 for this house, even though it's only worth $200,000, because I really want it and I need a place to live right now. And so that home that really is only worth $200,000, the bank, he borrowed from the bank $220,000 to buy it. Now the house wasn't really worth that much. So eventually, enough people got houses that the buying of houses slowed down. There weren't as many people competing for houses anymore. So the prices of houses went down. So let's pretend this house right here is the one that I bought for $220,000, even though it was only worth $200,000, right? And then very shortly after that, before I pay much off of that, the demand for houses go down. So now the house is only worth $200,000, but I owe the bank $220,000. That's a big problem, right? I owe the bank more than my house is really worth. And so the prices of houses and property crashed. It was like a housing bubble, just like our dot-com bubble. And a lot of people were losing money because they were paying more for their houses than it was really worth. Or let's say I wanted to go sell it. I owe the bank $220,000, but now I need to move because I got a job in a different city. Let's just pretend, right? So I go to sell it to someone, and I can only get this much because that's really all the house is worth. But I owe the bank $220,000. So I don't even have enough money when I sell my house to pay back the bank. So I've got this huge debt of $20,000, right? You can see how that's a problem. That was called the housing bubble, and that happened from about 2006 to 2007. So a lot of people couldn't afford to pay their loans because their houses weren't worth as much as they paid for them, and so they had to foreclose their homes, and that was a really bad thing. And so what we had going on was what I like to call economy, dominoes. Okay, and so here's kind of the economy dominoes. We had the housing bubble burst, right? People got crazy and bought houses and property for way more than it was worth, and then the demand slowed down and the value crashed. Okay, and so banks stopped mortgage loans. Banks were like, oh boy, we probably should stop giving out loans so easily, especially risky ones. And then when the banks stopped giving loans, that means people had to cut back on spending. If you can't get a loan from the bank, you're not going to go out and buy stuff, whether that be a house or stuff for your house, right? So stores were selling less, and Menards was selling less home building supplies and things like that. And so when people aren't spending as much, businesses have to cut workers. You see how this is a big chain reaction? If not as many people are shopping at Menards because not as many people are buying new homes, then Menards is going to have to cut some workers, right? And then since businesses have to cut workers, people lost jobs. And when people lose jobs, they have less money to spend, which means other companies aren't going to have people going into them and spending money. So other companies are going to have to cut workers. And if they cut workers, then those people have less money to spend. You see, this is just this domino effect, right? And so when the housing bubble burst happened in the mid-2000s, after the dot-com burst had already happened, our economy kind of crashed down a little bit. Not just in the United States, but around the world too. In places like Europe, because we sell a lot of our products there, and they sell a lot to us. They began to have struggles too in the mid-2000s to first decade of the 2000s, 2006, 2007 to about 2010. Much of the world's economy was really struggling. So President Bush was still president in 2008. When all this struggle was going on in our economy, and when the banks were starting to struggle because they weren't able to, give out loans, and they were, not many people were buying homes because we had the home crash, right, and things like that. That's how banks make money, from loans. Our economy is really struggling, and what President Bush thought is he thought that the banks were too big to fail. Banks like U.S. Bank and Wells Fargo, those are billion-dollar companies, right? And he thought, yeah, we're in a tough time, but I don't know that I should do real much because those banks are too big to fail. Plus, he's a Republican, right? Remember, Republicans typically don't like to make more programs or spend lots more money, right? Democrats are the ones that do that. So as a Republican, he chose to not do a whole lot. He thought the government shouldn't get involved and we should let our economy recover by itself. However, Congress disagreed with him. In 2008, remember, Congress is the one who finally makes the laws and who can, pass new bills and things like that. They did what was called a bailout. They gave us millions and billions of dollars to different banks and investment companies. You can see some of these companies that got given billions of dollars to help them stay alive. Because if banks close or fail, then people are going to lose a lot of money if they have their money stored in banks, or then there'll be no one to give out loans, and that could be a big problem and really put our economy in a tough spot, right? But many people weren't satisfied in 2008 with the way our economy was going and how our president was doing and handling things. And usually when that happens, when our economy isn't doing well, our United States citizens will pick a different president of a different party the next time an election happens. Now, President Bush couldn't run again, but he was a Republican, and you can guess that the next election we're going to have a Democrat win, which is going to be President Obama, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with. That's kind of like right now. Our economy is really struggling right now because of the coronavirus. A lot of people are losing their jobs, and our economy is going to be in kind of a tight spot probably for a little while, which is making Donald Trump nervous because this next November we need to pick a new president, right? Now, he is eligible to run again, but many people are wondering if this economy that's struggling is going to cause him to lose to Joe Biden, who seems to be the Democrat that they're about to choose. So there's kind of a connection to what we're going through right now, too. So you can see on this chart of the U.S. economy how right here, right, is what we're talking about right now. Then about 2008, 2009 especially, starting really in about 2006, 2007, our economy really started to struggle towards the end of the first 10 years of the 2000s. And you'll see it'll eventually climb back up. We'll get to that eventually, but right now we're talking about this really tough time. So one of the first things President Obama did when he got into office is he helped pass the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And what this did is the Congress gave a lot of funds to create new jobs for Americans, to do, fix up different governmental lands and things like that. They increased pay that people get if they're unemployed or disabled. They gave out more food stamps to those who couldn't have jobs to afford to pay food for their families. They started a lot of new projects in schools and airports as a way to create jobs, and they reduced taxes. So notice he has a very Democrat approach to this. Let's make all these new programs to help people who are out of work. Some people thought that it worked really well and thought it was a great idea. Obviously, many people who were Democrat thought that, hey, this is the way we should do it, whereas many Republicans thought this was terrible and was spending too much money. And you can see whenever something like this is done, there's always a battle between Republicans and Democrats, right, over what the right action is. But most people think that this helped America recover a little bit. Even though in 2010 is about as far as our book takes us today, things were still struggling a little bit. Workers were still having trouble getting jobs. Many businesses were still cutting workers or not able to hire more people. And so especially low-paying jobs were the ones that were cut first. And so there were a lot of people suffering. About 10% of people in 2009 had no jobs. And now that's getting to that point again here in our modern times in 2020, aren't we, with the coronavirus? A lot of people have lost their jobs. So we might have a little bit of a difficult economic time period here after all this is said and done. We'll see. That's one of the things they're worried about in the news right now. We'll see where that goes. But here's the thing. Whenever our government starts a new program or gives money to banks to help bail them out or goes to war like in Iraq and Afghanistan like we did in the early 2000s, right, that costs a lot of money. And someone has to pay for it. And so our government, to pay for that, takes out loans. And when they take out loans, they use that to pay for military equipment or use that as money to pay people who are out of work with unemployment and insurance and things like that, or use it to keep banks from failing, right? That costs a lot of money. So you can see right about where our government started to fail, all of a sudden our government's debt began to climb really quickly. Now, our United States government has what's called a debt ceiling. That's the maximum amount of debt that the United States is allowed to owe. Now, our Congress has voted 78 times in our nation's history to increase that amount of debt because we've had to. We've had things come up that we just couldn't go without money for, and so we had to take out more debt and borrow more money or print more money 78 different times. And during this time period in the late or early decade of the first decade of the 2000s, right, to help kind of our economy like get back together and get fixed, we did have to borrow a lot of money to pay out those banks to keep them from going into out of business, and to pay for those expensive wars against terrorism. And so that's been a controversy ever since. Is the United States debt is just climbing really, really fast, out of control, because we've had to fight terrorism during the 2000s, which is very, very expensive. And now just recently with this coronavirus, maybe your parents got their $1,200 check that the United States government gave to every single American adult. Every single one. If you don't live with your family anymore and you're over 18, you got a $1,200 check in the mail, plus $500 for every child that lives in your house. So at my house, we got over $4,000 of free money. What the United States is trying to do, led by Donald Trump, is to try to get our economy working again. And he felt if everybody had a little extra money to spend, they would go to businesses and restaurants and spend that money, which meant that those businesses and restaurants wouldn't have to cut workers and could allow people to keep working for them because they've got money coming. And you see what he's trying to do. But here's the problem. That's not just free money. The United States, that's trillions of dollars, right? Billions of dollars, I should say, that the United States is giving out. And so that's not just free money. They had to take out loans to do that. And so that's going to put our national debt even higher. And here's this concern. Our debt could grow so big that we can never pay it back. And then, if you have a friend who asks to borrow money and they pay you back all the time, you probably would be fine doing it. Hey, can I have a couple dollars to go buy a candy bar or something? If it's a friend who always pays you back, you'd probably say, sure. But what if it was a friend who every time borrows money from you, they never pay you back? You'd stop borrowing money to them. And that's the danger, that companies and other nations may stop borrowing money or lending money to the United States because they don't trust us to pay it back. And sometime we've got to pay this debt now that's in the trillions and trillions of dollars. But how are we going to do that? Who knows? Nobody's really sure, because right now our government for the last probably about 20 years has been spending more money than it's been bringing in because of some expensive wars on terrorism and things like this coronavirus that have come up. So that's a big concern. So I've shown you this before, but I'm going to take you to the most recent U.S. debt clock. There's actually a website you can go to that tracks just how much in debt our country is in. And then your assignment is you're going to watch a video. You're going to see what it means that our country's in debt. Like, who are they borrowing from, and who do they owe money to, and how does that work, and how does our government pay its debt off? You're going to find some interesting things out about our national debt and why some people are really concerned. Because someday we're going to have to pay this off, and it's probably already too big to ever pay off. And that could cause some big-time problems someday in the future. So here's a look at our nation's current debt. So here it is. I pulled up the website here, and take a look. Look how much money our government owes. I'll circle it in blue. Here it is. You see that? 24,728,755,770,000 and plus. It's just adding up and up. So our government's debt is just climbing. You can see the numbers just going up and up and up. Take a look at some of these crazy numbers. That's an average of $75,000 for every U.S. citizen. And that's crazy. $199,000 for every U.S. citizen who pays taxes. So how in the world will we ever pay this off if the average person who's old enough to pay taxes would have to pay almost $200,000, like a whole house value worth of taxes to ever get this paid off? That's a big problem our government's going to have to eventually deal with, sometime not too far off in the future, because otherwise, pretty soon, no one's going to borrow our government money anymore because they don't trust us to ever pay it back. And so that's a big, big problem that someday in our government we're going to have to solve, or it's going to lead to a really difficult economy for us. So that's what your video will be about today, and you'll have an Edpuzzle video and some questions to answer. I think you'll find it fascinating and interesting to hear about the massive U.S. debt that keeps building up. And kind of what I want you to pull from this section is that the years from the late 1990s to the early 2000s, 2000 to about 2010, our country struggled a little bit. Times were hard. Many people were out of work. We had the dot-com bubble burst, the housing burst. All of that was going on, and it took a few years for our government to recover and our economy to recover. Now, early in the next 10 years, our government really will recover. From about 2010 to 2020 or so, our economy was actually doing very, very well. Up until now, this coronavirus. Economies typically go in waves. And so we were, I would say, right about here in 2020. But now because of the coronavirus, many people think our economy might struggle a little bit for a few years. We'll see. Only God knows the future, but that's an interesting look into what's going on in our world history right now. So enjoy the video. Have a good day, guys. We'll talk to you again in social studies at least next week, Monday. Will be our next social studies class. None on Friday. Have a good day.